The laughter still echoes in my ears, sharp, hollow, and cruel. I can still see my daughter's small hands trembling as she lifted the lid of that pretty, glittering box. Inside it, nothing, just air. And then the words that cut through everything. Kids like her don't deserve anything. They said it with a smirk, as if my child's worth could be measured in ribbons and wrapping paper. And in that instant, watching my little girl's face fall, seeing her tiny shoulders tighten, something inside me cracked open. That betrayal lit a fire in me I never thought I had. My name is Rachel. Before I go on, tell me, where are you watching from? I always love knowing who's sitting with me for stories like these, because this one still burns when I tell it. Let me take you back to that day. It was Christmas afternoon at my in-laws' house, the kind of place that looks perfect from the outside. Golden lights twinkling in the frosty air, the scent of baked ham and cinnamon drifting through the halls. Vivian, my mother-in-law, had spent days bragging about her perfect holiday setup. She said it like it was a competition, as if family gatherings were just another way to prove she was better than everyone else. The living room was crowded, cousins, siblings, nieces, all gathered around the enormous tree. My husband Daniel sat beside me, quiet, his gaze bouncing between his parents and his phone. I remember thinking how distant he looked, as though he'd already learned it was safer to say nothing in this house. Then came the moment of the gifts. Vivian clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, let's see who's been good this year," she said, her voice syrupy and proud. One by one, shiny packages were handed out. Everyone's name was called. Laughter filled the air, paper ripped, children squealed. It was loud and bright and warm until it wasn't. When she called Mia's name, the room fell strangely quiet. My daughter, just 10 years old, skipped forward shyly, her eyes glowing with the kind of excitement only children can still have. She had spent the week making handmade cards for everyone, even her grandparents. She'd stayed up past bedtime, cutting hearts and writing, "I love you, Grandma and Grandpa," in her crooked, careful handwriting. Vivian handed her a small, glittering box wrapped in gold foil. "Go on, sweetheart," she said, her tone honeyed but sharp around the edges. "Open it." Mia tore the paper slowly, cautious not to ruin it. She always said she wanted to reuse wrapping for her dolls. When she lifted the lid, I leaned forward with a smile, expecting at least a trinket, but then I saw her face. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the way her lips parted, trembling. "It's empty," she whispered. And before I could say anything, before Daniel could react, Vivian laughed, a full, mocking laugh that sliced through the air. "Well," she said, "kids like her don't deserve anything fancy. Maybe next year she'll learn not to expect so much." The room froze. For a second, no one moved. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. Then, as if on cue, the cousins laughed too awkwardly, nervously, not sure if it was a joke or not. Daniel said nothing. He didn't even look at me. He just pressed his lips together and stared at the carpet. I wanted to speak, to shout, to grab that glittering box and throw it back at them, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel the sting of humiliation, not for me, but for my little girl standing there with an empty box and a breaking heart. Then Mia did something I'll never forget. She closed the lid quietly, set the box on the coffee table, and said with a calmness that didn't belong to a 10-year-old, "Justice." The word hung in the air like smoke. No one understood it, not then. Vivian blinked, uncertain. Daniel looked up, startled. I just stared at my daughter, wondering what she meant. Mia turned and walked to the window, staring out at the snow falling softly outside. She didn't cry, not a single tear. Later, when the laughter awkwardly resumed, I sat in silence, holding that word in my chest like a secret ember. Justice. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me and whispered, "Mom, it's okay. They showed me who they are." And that's when I knew something had shifted, not just in her, but in me. That was the night my daughter's innocence met their cruelty, and the night I decided I would never let her stand alone in that kind of silence again. Because no child, no matter how small, should ever have to earn love. Fine. And no mother should ever have to swallow that kind of humiliation in her own family's home. If I've learned anything in life, it's that cruelty rarely begins loudly. It starts as whispers disguised as jokes, concerns, or advice. Before the laughter, there were years of little cuts, each one small enough to ignore, but together they bled me dry. When I first met Daniel's parents, I was 25, young, hopeful, too eager to be accepted. I'd grown up in a modest home with a single mother who taught me that love wasn't about possessions, but presence. Vivian and Robert, on the other hand, were the kind of people who measured worth in square footage, family names, and dinnerware, sets that cost more than a month's rent. The first time I visited their house, I remember Vivian's handshake, delicate, cool, and brief, as though she were touching something fragile she didn't want to claim. Her eyes scanned me like she was checking an exam she hadn't agreed to grade. "Oh," she said, smiling too tightly. "You're Rachel, from the community college, right?" Her tone made community sound like a stain. Robert stood behind her, kind enough on the surface, but detached, the kind of man whose silence always seemed to agree with his wife. I told myself to be patient. I told myself love could soften them. In those early days, Daniel was different, or maybe I just wanted to believe he was. He'd hold my hand at family dinners, laugh at their jokes even when they were cruel, then whisper afterward, "Don't take it personally, babe. That's just Mom." The first Christmas I spent with them was awkward, but I convinced myself it was just nerves. I'd spent weeks baking pies from scratch, wrapping thoughtful gifts I couldn't afford. I wanted them to see I cared. Vivian opened her gift first, a framed photo of Daniel and me smiling by the lake. She stared at it for a long moment, then said lightly, "Well, it's not my style, but it's thoughtful." Everyone chuckled. That was the first little cut. The next came when she looked at me and said, "You'll make a fine homemaker someday, Rachel. Just keep Daniel focused on his career. A man's stability is a family's best chance." She meant, don't outshine him, don't dream too loud. I laughed it off, but deep down, something small and stubborn inside me refused to shrink. When Mia was born, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe a grandchild would melt Vivian's sharp edges. I was wrong. I still remember the day we told them we were having a girl. Vivian's smile faltered. "Oh," she said flatly. "Well, that's nice." Robert patted Daniel's shoulder and muttered, "Next time, son. Next time," as if my daughter's life was a failed attempt. I went home that night and cried quietly in the nursery we'd just painted yellow. Daniel tried to comfort me, but his words felt hollow. "They'll come around," he said. "They just grew up in a different time, but sometimes don't excuse cruelty." The months after Mia's birth were lonely. Vivian visited once, stayed for 10 minutes, and criticized how I folded the baby's clothes. Robert said nothing. Daniel worked late. I learned to stop expecting affection. Instead, I poured every ounce of love I had into Mia. She became my world, my laughter, my light, and she noticed things early. Kids always do. "Why doesn't Grandma hug me like she hugs the others?" she asked one day after a family picnic. I froze. The truth stuck in my throat like a thorn. "Maybe she just doesn't know how to show it," I said. But that wasn't true. Vivian showed it easily to her other grandchildren, Daniel's sister's kids, with gifts, attention, and exaggerated praise. By the time Mia turned 6, I had stopped hoping for fairness. We were tolerated, not loved. I started saving money, quietly, small bits from freelance work, the change from groceries, because something inside me whispered that one day I might need to stand on my own 2 feet. Still, I tried. Every year I sent cards, brought desserts, played polite. I thought kindness would win her over eventually. But kindness without respect becomes submission, and I had been bowing for too long. There's a strange thing that happens when you endure quiet cruelty for years. You begin to doubt your own instincts. You start asking yourself, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe they're not that bad. Until one day someone hurts the person you love more than anything, and suddenly the fog clears. When Mia opened that empty box, I didn't just see a cruel joke. I saw every moment that had led us there, every time I'd stayed silent, every time Daniel said, "Just let it go," every time I'd chosen peace over dignity. That was the cost of my patience. And though I didn't know it yet, that Christmas would mark the end of something in me and the beginning of something I never expected, the strength to stop asking for acceptance and start demanding respect. Because love that humiliates isn't love at all. I used to believe that silence could keep peace, that if I swallowed my hurt long enough, one day it would turn into understanding. But the truth is, silence doesn't heal anything. It just feeds the ones who thrive on it. After that first wave of disappointments, I told myself things would get better. They didn't. By the time Mia started school, the distance between Daniel's parents and us had grown into something almost natural. an invisible wall we had learned to live beside. They came around on birthdays and holidays, wearing polite smiles that never reached their eyes. I told myself it was enough. But Mia noticed. Children always notice what adults try to hide. When she was in first grade, she brought home a drawing of a family tree. Every branch had colorful leaves, names, and hearts, except one. Under Grandma and Grandpa, she'd drawn a gray cloud instead of a leaf. "Why's that cloud there?" I asked gently. She looked at me, serious and small. "Because they don't like sunshine, Mom." I laughed softly, though my throat ached. Out of the mouths of babes, truth always slips uninvited. Family dinners became harder to sit through. Vivian had a talent for cruelty disguised as humor. She'd comment on everything, my cooking, my dress, even Mia's quiet nature. "She's such a shy thing," Vivian would say in front of everyone, a glass of wine swirling in her hand. "Takes after her mother, I suppose. Hopefully she grows out of it. Life's not kind to timid girls." Laughter, always laughter. Robert never corrected her. He'd clear his throat or look at the TV, but never once tell her she was out of line. His silence was a shadow that backed up every word she spoke. I'd sit there, smiling tightly, trying to hold the atmosphere together for Daniel's sake. He'd nudge my hand under the table, whispering, "Let it go, please." So I did, again and again. But letting it go meant letting a piece of myself dissolve each time. Outside of those family gatherings, life was ordinary. I took a part-time job at a small bookshop downtown, a cozy place with the smell of old paper and coffee. It gave me space to breathe, and I started saving a bit from each paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Mia would come after school, sitting on a stool behind the counter, drawing while I organized shelves. Sometimes she'd draw boxes, different shapes and sizes, each one with something written inside. "This one's for love," she'd say, "and this one's for secrets." I used to wonder where she got that quiet wisdom. Now I think she was just watching us all very closely. Then came the summer before the empty box incident. Vivian threw her annual family brunch. Everyone was invited. Daniel's siblings, their kids, even old family friends. I dreaded it every year, but I went anyway. Dressed in the pastel dress Vivian had once said suited me best because it doesn't call too much attention. Halfway through the meal, she leaned across the table and said, "Rachel, dear, you really should start pushing Mia into activities. Dance, maybe. She'll get too plain otherwise." I smiled politely, though I could feel my face burning. "She's not plain," I said softly. "She's thoughtful and kind." Vivian laughed. "Kindness doesn't win prizes, darling." For a moment, no one spoke. Even Daniel looked away. That was the moment the cracks in the perfect family started to show. I began to notice how fragile their laughter really was, how every joke was a shield, every compliment a currency. Their lives were polished on the outside, hollow on the inside. But I wasn't innocent in it. I was part of the illusion, too. I played the role of the good daughter-in-law, the peacemaker, the woman who never made scenes, until I realized that my silence was the only thing keeping their cruelty comfortable. One night that fall, after a particularly tense dinner, I stood at the sink washing dishes while Daniel scrolled through his phone at the table. I asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like we're pretending?" He looked up. "Pretending what?" "That this is a family, that they care about us." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "They do, in their own way. It's just complicated. My mom's old-fashioned." "Old-fashioned doesn't mean cruel, Daniel." He said nothing. That was the night I decided something inside our home had to change. If Daniel wouldn't speak for us, then I would. But I wasn't ready yet. The courage I needed was still gathering, like thunder behind a cloud. And when the storm finally broke, it came wrapped in glittering paper and cruel laughter. I didn't know it then, but that Christmas morning, the one that would leave my daughter holding an empty box, wasn't just another holiday. It was the breaking point of years of quiet endurance. It was the moment their cracks finally became visible and mine finally split open. There are moments in life that burn themselves into your memory so deeply that no matter how many years pass, you can still smell the air, still hear the smallest sounds. That Christmas was one of them. The world outside was wrapped in white silence. Snow had fallen all night, soft and endless, blanketing everything in a quiet that felt holy. Inside Vivian and Robert's grand living room, the opposite was true. Laughter, chatter, the clinking of glasses. The house glowed with golden light, and yet I felt cold. I'd worn the red dress Daniel had picked for me, festive, he said. It'll make Mom happy, he'd added, as though my entire purpose was to keep her comfort intact. Mia had chosen her own outfit, a cream sweater with tiny reindeer stitched on it. She looked like the very picture of Christmas innocence. When we arrived, Vivian greeted everyone with wide, showy affection kisses, compliments, laughter. When she saw us, her smile cooled. "Well, if it isn't the Little family," she said. "Rachel, dear, that color's bold. And Mia, you've gotten taller. Still so quiet, though." Mia smiled politely, the way I'd taught her to, but her eyes flickered toward me, a tiny, uncertain glance I didn't miss. The tree stood tall in the center of the room, covered in ornaments that looked more expensive than meaningful. Beneath it, a sea of presents glimmered. Vivian loved excess, every gift coordinated, every bow symmetrical. It looked perfect, if you didn't look too closely. Dinner passed in the usual rhythm conversations about business, vacation homes, and Daniel's sister's brilliant children. Mia tried to tell her grandfather about the story she wrote in school, but he waved her off, saying, "Tell me later, sweetheart. Grandpa's listening to something important." I clenched my hands under the table. Daniel didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. After dinner, Vivian clapped her manicured hands. "All right, everyone, time for gifts," the children squealed. Wrapping paper flew. There were delighted gasps, thank yous, hugs. The room glowed with the kind of joy you can only fake when the cameras are on. Then finally, Vivian's voice cut through the noise. "And now Mia's turn." The laughter dimmed. Eyes turned. I didn't know why, but something about her tone made the air feel heavy. She handed Mia a small glittering box gold wrapping, white ribbon. "This one's from us," she said. "Something very special." Mia smiled sweetly, innocently, and took it with both hands. "Thank you, Grandma." Vivian gave a quick nod. "Go on, open it." Mia untied the ribbon carefully, as she always did. She peeled back the paper slowly, not wanting to tear it. Everyone watched. I could hear the soft tearing of the last strip of tape, the tiny sigh of air as she lifted the lid, and then silence. Her little fingers froze, her brow furrowed. She looked down, confused, then up at me. "It's empty." Her voice was small, puzzled, not yet hurt. And then Vivian laughed, a full, open laugh that filled the room like the cracking of ice. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "Kids like you shouldn't expect too much. Maybe next year you'll deserve something more." There it was, the words that shattered the air. The cousins hesitated, then giggled because they thought they were supposed to. Robert chuckled weakly. Daniel went pale, and I couldn't breathe. Every sound faded, replaced by the thundering of my heart. My hands shook under the table. For a second I thought I'd stand up, shout, grab that box, and throw it into the fireplace. But something stronger held me down, the weight of every time I'd stayed quiet before. Mia didn't cry. She just stared at her grandmother for a moment, then at the empty box. Her lips trembled once, and then she closed it carefully and set it on the coffee table. "Justice," she said softly. Her voice was calm, clear, final. No one knew what to say. Vivian blinked, her smirk faltering. Robert looked away. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he still said nothing. Mia turned and walked toward the window. Snowflakes pressed against the glass, melting on contact. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection small and still against the winter night. I watched her, my brave, quiet girl, and something inside me changed. That was the moment I realized that silence wasn't peace, it was permission. When we drove home later that night, Daniel tried to speak, but I didn't let him. I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel. Mia hummed softly in the back seat, clutching the handmade cards she'd brought for everyone, the ones she'd never gotten to give. At a red light, she asked, "Mom? Why would they do that?" I swallowed hard. "Because sometimes people confuse cruelty with power, sweetheart." She nodded slowly, thoughtful. Then she said, "That's okay. I know what to do next time." Her tone sent a shiver through me. I didn't understand what she meant then, not fully, but I would, soon. When we got home, I tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and sat alone in the dark living room. The tree lights flickered softly. I looked at our modest little gifts, imperfect, mismatched, but real. I thought about Vivian's laughter, about that glittering empty box, about my daughter's word, justice. And for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I planned because they wanted cruelty to be a lesson. Now it was my turn to teach. The next morning, the world outside our window glowed white. The snow had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt like an echo heavy, waiting. I sat by the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold between my hands, thinking about the night before, the laughter, the silence, the empty box. I kept replaying Mia's small voice in my head, steady, unshaken. Justice. It wasn't just a word, it was a promise. Daniel shuffled into the kitchen sometime after 8, his hair messy, his face pale with shame or exhaustion, maybe both. He sat across from me without saying a word. Finally, he muttered, "My mom went too far." I didn't look at him. "She didn't just go too far, Daniel. She humiliated a 10-year-old. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know how she is. She tries to be funny, but—" I slammed my mug down, the sound startling him. Don't make excuses for her. Not this time." He flinched, looking like a boy again, not a man, not a husband, not a father, just a boy afraid of his mother's disapproval. For years, I'd softened every blow, smoothed every rough edge, made peace where peace didn't belong. But something inside me had hardened. "She crossed a line," I said, "and you let her." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but then closed it again. "What do you want me to do, Rachel? You want me to cut them off?" "Yes," I said simply, "or at least stop pretending they deserve us." He stared at me for a long moment, then dropped his gaze. "I'll talk to her," he whispered, but I knew he wouldn't. He never did. That was the moment I realized that if change was going to happen, it wouldn't come from Daniel. It would come from me. A week later, I stood in our living room with rolls of wrapping paper spread across the floor. Mia sat beside me, coloring. The tree lights blinked faintly in the background, the same lights that had watched us return home, broken that night. "Mom," she said suddenly, "are we going back to Grandma's for New Year's?" Her tone was innocent, but her eyes, those clear, steady eyes, held something deeper. "Yes," I said slowly, "we are." "Why?" "Because," I said, smiling faintly, "sometimes you have to return the gift you were given just in your own way." She tilted her head, curious. "Like a trade?" "Something like that." Mia didn't ask more. She just nodded, as if she understood. I spent the next few days preparing, not in anger, but in calm, cold, deliberate calm. I gathered a few small boxes the same size as the one they'd given Mia. I wrapped each with care gold paper, white ribbon, just like Vivian's. The perfection was the point. Inside each, I placed something personal, not cruel but true. For Daniel's sister, I wrote a letter reminding her of the time I held her hand through her divorce, when no one else in the family would. I ended it with, "Empathy is the gift I wish this family understood." For Robert, I placed an old photograph I'd found years ago while cleaning their attic, one he didn't know I had. It was of him as a young man, holding a baby in his arms. The baby wasn't Daniel. The back of the photo had a name written in faded ink, Michael. Daniel once told me Robert had another child from before, a name that was never spoken in that house again. The story had always been vague. "He left," Daniel said once, "and Dad never talks about it." Now I understood why. Robert, the man who had laughed when my daughter received nothing, had once given nothing to his own child. For Vivian, I prepared something simpler, a small, elegant card that read, "Love is not a competition, it's a reflection." Beneath it, I placed a mirror shard wrapped in soft silk. When Mia saw me packing the boxes, she asked, "Mom, are these nice gifts?" "They're honest gifts," I said. She smiled slightly. "Good." On New Year's Eve, we drove back to that house. The lights gleamed just as they had a week before, but everything felt different. I felt different. Vivian greeted us with her usual showy cheer, as if nothing had happened. "Oh, you came after all," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to after Christmas." I smiled politely. "We wouldn't miss it." She looked almost disappointed that I hadn't arrived angry, but anger was too small a thing for what I carried now. The evening passed with the same fake laughter, the same hollow chatter, and then, as midnight approached, I stood and said, "Before the year ends, I brought a few gifts, just to start the next one, honestly." The room quieted. Vivian's smile faltered. I handed each box with the same grace she'd once used on Christmas morning, Robert's last. He took it, chuckling awkwardly. "What's this, Rachel? Another one of your thoughtful surprises?" "Something like that," I said softly. As they began to open their boxes, I sat back, watching, calm, still, ready. Because this wasn't revenge. It was truth wrapped in gold paper and tied with ribbon. And I knew, as Robert slowly lifted the lid and the color drained from his face, that this was just the beginning. Robert's hand trembled as he held the small photograph. The gold wrapping paper had fallen to the floor, his laughter dying in his throat, as if someone had turned off a switch inside him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Vivian leaned forward, her tone sharp. "What's that?" Robert didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the picture, his younger self smiling, holding a baby that clearly wasn't Daniel. Then Mia, sitting quietly beside me, said in her small but clear voice, "That's him, isn't it, Grandpa?" Robert looked up at her, his lips parting, but no sound came out. His face had gone pale as if he were looking at a ghost. "Yes," I said softly, "it's him. From a long time ago." Vivian reached for the photo, but Robert pulled it back instinctively. "Where did you get this?" His voice cracked, part anger, part panic. "I found it years ago," I said, my tone even, "while helping you organize the attic. You had no right to keep it," he snapped. "You're right," I said. "But then again, you had no right to erase someone either." The room was utterly still now. Even Daniel didn't move. Vivian looked between us, her eyes narrowing. "What is this about, Rachel? What are you trying to do?" "I'm not trying to do anything," I said. "I'm simply returning what belongs to you. You gave my daughter an empty box and called it a joke. I'm giving you something full of truth." Vivian's eyes flashed with anger. "This is disgusting. You come into our house and—" "Your house?" I cut in, my voice low but steady. "You mean the house built on lies, cruelty, and selective memory." Daniel finally stood, his voice pleading. "Rachel, stop. Please." But I didn't. I couldn't. "This isn't about vengeance," I said, turning to face them all. "This is about balance, about showing you what it feels like to receive something you weren't expecting, something that forces you to look in a mirror." I nodded toward Vivian's unopened box. "Go ahead, Vivian, open yours." Her hands trembled as she peeled back the paper. Inside, she found the small, silk-wrapped mirror shard and the note. She unfolded it and read aloud, almost mockingly. "Love is not a competition, it's a reflection." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means the way you treat others says more about you than them," I said. "You've spent years measuring worth in status, control, and power. But love isn't earned by superiority. It's reflected by kindness, and you've long since forgotten what that looks like." Vivian's face flushed red. "How dare you? How dare you?" I interrupted, my voice shaking with emotion. "How dare you humiliate a child, your own granddaughter, in front of everyone? She's 10 years old, Vivian, 10. And yet she showed more dignity that night than this entire family combined." Vivian tried to speak again, but I raised a hand. "No, you've had your say for years. Tonight, you listen." Robert still sat motionless, the photo trembling in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You shouldn't have brought this up, Rachel. Some things are meant to stay buried." I met his eyes. Buried things have a way of rotting everything around them. Maybe it's time they saw the light. Vivian turned on him then, sharp and furious. "What is she talking about, Robert?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the edges of the photo. Then slowly he whispered, "It's true." Vivian's mouth fell open. "What?" "The boy in the photo," Robert said. "He's my son, from before you and I met. I left him and his mother. I never went back." The confession hung heavy in the room. Vivian staggered back a step, her expression unreadable. Daniel just stared, as if he were seeing his father for the first time. Mia reached for my hand, her grip warm and steady. Robert's eyes glistened. "I thought it was best for everyone. That family didn't fit the life I wanted, but I've thought about him every day since. And yet," I said softly, "you laughed when my daughter was made to feel unworthy. Maybe because somewhere deep down you still see yourself in that kind of rejection." He flinched. Vivian whispered, "Why didn't you ever tell me, Guy?" "Because I was ashamed," he said quietly. "I didn't want to be judged." Vivian let out a bitter laugh. "Judged? You've spent your whole life judging everyone else." Her voice cracked on the last word. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. Daniel stepped closer to me then, his voice low. "Rachel, I didn't know." "I know," I said. "But you do now, and so does Mia." I turned to my daughter, who was watching quietly, her eyes steady as ever. "This," I said to her, "is what truth looks like. It's messy, it hurts, but it's real." She nodded solemnly. The clock struck midnight just then, a clean sound cutting through the silence. Outside, fireworks began to bloom in the distance, but no one moved to watch. Vivian stood staring into her box, her reflection staring back from the broken shard. Robert still clutched the photo, and Daniel looked lost somewhere between shame and awakening. Mia leaned against me and whispered, "Mom, was that justice?" I looked around the room and at the cracks forming in the perfect family facade, at the truth that had finally surfaced. "Yes," I said softly, "it's a start." The fireworks outside painted the night sky in bursts of red and gold, but inside that house, the silence was louder than any explosion. No one moved. The only sound came from the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, counting each second that passed between the old year and the new one. Then Robert stood. He set the photograph gently on the table, his eyes glistening in the flickering light. "I think," he said softly, "I owe a lot of people an apology." His voice trembled, not from fear but from something deeper. Regret. Vivian said nothing. Her perfectly painted lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, she seemed small, like a woman who suddenly realized that her empire of control was built on sand. I didn't speak either. There was nothing left to add. Truth had already spoken for me. When the fireworks faded and the sky went dark again, Daniel cleared his throat. "I think we should go." I nodded. Mia slipped her hand into mine as we made our way toward the door. My coat was half on when Vivian finally found her voice. "Rachel," she called softly. I turned, half expecting another jab, another deflection, but her tone was different now, fragile, uncertain. She looked at Mia. I didn't mean to hurt you, sweetheart." Mia studied her quietly for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't hurt me. You showed me what kind of person I don't want to be." Vivian's eyes widened. Her hand went to her chest as if those words had pierced something she didn't know could still feel. I didn't need to add anything. That was Mia's truth, and it was perfect. We left then into the cold, crisp air that smelled like snow and endings. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't heavy. There was something cleansing about it, something light. The headlights stretched across the empty road, and the hum of the tires felt almost peaceful. Daniel kept glancing at me, his hands tight on the wheel. Finally, he said, "I should have stood up for you, for her." I didn't respond right away. Then I said quietly, "You still can." But standing up means more than words, Daniel. It means choosing what kind of man you want to be, not just what kind of son. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I think I've known for a long time." We didn't talk much after that. Some conversations don't need words. They just unfold in silence, waiting for action to follow. When we reached home, Mia was half asleep in the back seat. I carried her upstairs, tucked her into bed, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Mom?" she murmured sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grandpa will ever find his other son?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe, if he's brave enough to look." She nodded, her eyes fluttering closed. "I hope he does. Everyone deserves someone who doesn't forget them." Her words lingered long after she drifted off. Downstairs, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in soft snow that reflected the moonlight like crushed glass. I thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the silence, the laughter that had cut so deep it nearly bled me dry. And then I thought about the look on Vivian's face when she saw herself in that shard of mirror, the crack in Robert's voice when he said the words, "I left him." Maybe they'd change, maybe they wouldn't, but that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd spent too many years trying to earn approval that should have been freely given, too many holidays pretending that family meant tolerance of cruelty. Not anymore. I looked toward the stairs where my daughter slept peacefully, her innocence still intact, her spirit unbroken. And in that quiet, I realized something simple yet profound. Mia didn't need perfect grandparents. She needed a mother who showed her what self-respect looked like. That was the real inheritance I could give her. A week later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was shaky, familiar. It was from Robert. Inside was the photograph, the same one I'd returned to him, but this time there was a note attached. "Rachel, you were right. Buried things do rot what's around them. I found Michael. He's alive. We spoke on the phone. I don't know what comes next, but for the first time in decades, I told the truth. Thank you for making me see what I'd refused to face, Robert." I read it twice before setting it down. My hands trembled, not from anger or sadness, but from something else, relief. Justice had bloomed in the strangest way, not through revenge, but revelation. That night, as I watched the snow fall again, I thought of the empty box, the cruel joke that had started it all. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything they hadn't expected to find that night: truth, consequence, and the kind of strength that grows only after deep pain. Mia came downstairs in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Can we make hot chocolate, Mom?" I smiled, pulling her close. "Of course." She looked up at me and whispered, "I'm glad you gave them their gifts." I laughed softly. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." We sat together, sipping cocoa, watching the snow blur the world outside, and for the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel like something I had to fight for. It just felt earned.